Regarding an objective standard, do you have an objective standard of morality by which you can judge whether or not something is morally right or wrong?
Well, yes and no. I will say that I started off with an objective standard when I was younger. Mainly from society. I took society's basic standard and took it as my own. It's pretty much absolute. Don't kill people, don't steal from people, no sex without marriage, and so on, and so on, and so on. Because those were the standard societal norms when I was younger. So I suppose from a certain point of view, I took those as an objective standard. Over time, though, if you want to think of the standard of society as being a wall, I took out some bricks that I, over time, began to disagree with, threw those away, replaced them with other bricks, added bricks to the wall that I didn't think of when I was younger, and had to when I was older, until eventually, while the wall has the basic appearance of the societal morality that I started with, I can't really call it an objective standard anymore. I have a very subjective standard. So I suppose it's evolved from an objective standard when I was younger to now a subjective standard now that I'm older and have had time and experience really influence my morality. Question number 2.
If you do not have an objective standard of morality by which you can determine what is right or wrong, then from where do you get your morals?
Well, like I said, I started with an objective standard from society, and then over time, through experience, through logic, through talking to people, my morals changed. An example of something from experience, I suppose, would be when I was younger, I delivered pizzas for a living, and I got robbed at knife point. And until that point, I understood kind of arbitrarily why thievery was wrong. Now I have a very strong moral position that especially armed thievery is wrong, because I was freaking terrified. He pulled a knife out on me that I can still visualize this day. I have no idea what he looked like, but I can still remember how that knife looked like. I was terrified for my life, and I would never put someone else through that. And my position on that is much more stronger than it used to be because of that experience. Another example might be, that's not quite as potent, is the subject of killing another human being. Now, I do believe that, of course, murder is wrong, as do most other people in society. But I joined the military. I'm no longer I'm in the inactive reserve, but I'm no longer active duty. But when I joined the military, I had to make a decision. Do I think that I would be willing to kill somebody? Or at the very least, am I willing for my actions to help someone else kill somebody? And I decided that if I was in that situation, that I would. And that I would believe it would be morally right, because I'm protecting myself, I'm protecting my buddies that I'm with. On a greater scheme, I'm helping to protect my country. And I decided, morally, that that was okay. And while I was never put into that position, I was in a position where I was helping other people kill other people for those reasons. And I had to decide that I was okay with that. And it made me question my morals and change them in that way. Another example from the logic point of view was when I was very young in middle school. We were posed a question by a teacher of whether or not teenagers, younger teenagers, like 14, 16-year-olds, should be allowed to buy condoms. And I instinctively said, in the group that I was paired up with, no. And I said that really as a knee-jerk reaction, because I had taken at that point, objective standard that you should not have sex before marriage. So obviously, if you don't have sex before marriage, you shouldn't be able to get condoms before marriage, which made complete sense to my mind at that point in my life. And boy, I'm glad I said that, because I got jumped on by everyone else at my table and was really shown why I was wrong. That if 14, 16-year-old children are going to have sex, then they should have access to birth control. And it really made me realize that I needed to examine my morals and decide what I wanted to go with from what I had just blindly accepted when I was younger. And that was really the point at which I deviated from an objective standard to deciding I was going to take a more subjective one, although I didn't really understand the wording at the time. Looking back, that's where I branched off from that. So, to answer the question more concisely, my experience, my logic from other people convincing me that I'm in error on certain points in my reasoning, and originally from society is where I get my morals. Next question, question number 3.
If you do not have an objective standard of morality by which you can determine what is right and wrong, then how are your moral values not just based on your subjective opinions?
Well, this is kind of a foolish question. Of course they're based on my subjective opinions. You know, I logic through them, and then I come to an opinion on an issue. And I use that to inform my morals. That's pretty much the very definition of a subjective method to gaining your morals. And even if it's an issue that I've never thought of before, and I've always just kind of rode with the objective standard that I inherited from society when I was younger, when I get to a point where I have to question that, as long as I have time, as long as it's not a heat-of-the-moment decision, I do take the time to sit down and logic my way through it and come to an opinion on the subject which informs my morals. So, the answer to that is, I don't. You know, they are based on subjective opinions, and I accept that as a matter of course. Next question, question number 4.
If you do not have an objective standard of morality by which you can determine what is right or wrong, then what gives you the right to make moral judgments upon Nazi Germany or the God of the Bible?
Well, I think a better question is does anything prevent me from having the right to make moral judgments? And nothing does. You know, the very foundation of our civilization is on free speech and telling other people what our moral judgments are, and then coming to a consensus to create a societal norm for that moral position. And of course I have the right to make a moral judgment upon other societies' morals in the past, although I wouldn't say Nazi Germany was a society in and of itself. There was a German society that had Nazis in it. And a lot of what they did, they didn't tell the society. So I kind of reject Nazi Germany being used as a societal standard of morality in a lot of these discussions. As far as the God of the Bible, obviously I don't believe in the God of the Bible, but even if I did, why wouldn't I be able to challenge his or her moral views? It'd be almost ridiculous not to. You need, as a person, to make up your own mind. Otherwise, you're just... Oh, I don't want to say sheep, because I hate the term sheep. But you're just allowing yourself... How's the best way to put this? To not think for yourself. And I'm a very large proponent of thinking for yourself. And if you're going to think for yourself and make moral judgments, then certainly in modern society, where we do have the right of free speech, and where that is a huge part of society, you of course have the right to challenge other societies' moral judgments, or your own society's moral judgments, or your neighbor's moral judgments. It's what makes our society so great in the grand scheme of things. Next question, question number 5.
If you do not have an objective standard of morality by which you can determine what is right or wrong, then should anyone adhere to your moral standard of what is right and wrong?
Well, now this is an interesting question. Should anyone adhere to my moral standard of what is right or wrong? Well, because they're morals that I've gotten through logic, I think they should, but I don't think they should just because they are my moral standards. I think that they should come to their own view, and I do hope they come to my view, because obviously, you know, I've gotten to where I am through logic and reason and deciding what I think is right or wrong, sincerely. And if they get to a different point, I want to talk to them about that. I want to find out how they got to that point. Because I would either like to convince him that he's in the wrong, if I truly think he is, and if he truly thinks I'm in the wrong, I want him to try to convince me that I'm in the wrong. Because I want my morals to be as good as they can possibly be. And if I am in the wrong, like I do now believe that I was in the wrong with the birth control issue when I was younger, about children not being able to get birth control. I want to be challenged on that. I just don't want to blindly accept something without even realizing it. But I don't think someone should follow my moral code just because it's my moral code. That's why we fought a revolution, to get away from the whole kings and one person proclaiming from on high, this is the moral standard, you will follow it. I think that's a very dangerous position to take. Question number 6.
If you say that people should not adhere to your moral standard of what is right and wrong, then how is your standard of any value to anyone?
Well, like I said, it's a value to other people as, well, first a sounding board. If you have a different moral opinion from me, let's debate about it. Let's figure out if one of us can change the other person's mind, or at the very least come to an understanding of how we both got to those moral positions. So we can, even if we don't agree, can hopefully come to an understanding and a respect of how we both got to those moral positions, to better understand, A, how we're going to create a society or keep our society running, and also so we have a better understanding of how that other person's going to act in given situations. Like, to go back to me being in the military, the other people I was with, although we weren't in a combat role, knew that if we were, I would be willing to shoot someone to protect them, because they knew where my moral standard on that lay. And that was extremely important, certainly to them, and it was important for me to know that they would do that in return to save my life. So someone else's morality and understanding where their morality comes from and how they got there and where their positions are is extremely important, both in creating a society, creating a local community, and as a sounding board for yourself to understand your positions better and possibly to realize that you are in error and that you need to change your possibly long-held views. So they're extremely important to other people. Next question.
If you say that people should adhere to your subjective moral standard, then who decided that your subjective moral standard is the one that anyone should follow?
Well, like I already said, I don't think someone should follow my moral standard just because it's my moral standard. If they do follow my moral standard, I want it to be because they have come to the belief that it is a correct moral standard to follow. And they follow the same logic I do, and that's why they're going to follow it. So in that case, they're the ones deciding that my moral subjective standard is the correct one to follow. And if they don't, if somehow I'm forcing them to follow that, then that is wrong. It's very wrong. It's the source of a lot of problems in the world today. People forcing a standard on other people that may not be good for them or that they don't believe. And that's a serious problem. But if they did follow my moral standard, they would be the ones deciding to do so. I guess is the final answer to that question. Question number 8.
If you don't need an objective standard of morality by which you can judge what is right or wrong, then how do you determine what is right or wrong?
Well, I mean, I think I've already answered this question. I determine what is right and wrong by my morals, of course, which I derived from my experiences, through logic, through other people convincing me of certain issues, and originally the bedrock for them was the objective standard from society, of course. But honestly, I think I've already answered this question quite thoroughly, of how I determine what is right and wrong. It's, like I said, experience, logic, influence from other people, and society at large. Question number 9.
If you don't need an objective standard of morality by which you can determine what is right or wrong, then how do you know that what you think is right and wrong really is right and wrong?
Well, now this is a tricky question, and I say that because it's a trick question. And if you see what they did here, you'll realize why, and if not, I'm about to explain it. What he's done here is, I obviously don't think I need an objective standard of morality. I started with one, as I've explained, but it's since become a subjective standard of morality. But because I don't think that there's an objective standard of reality anymore, I don't think that anything is intrinsically right or wrong. You know, there aren't two countries on the map called right Donia and wrong Donia, and all actions belong to one or the other with no neutral ground. I don't think that. So why would I think that whatever I think is right or wrong belongs to either the camp of right or wrong, and that I can be either right or wrong and deciding that they're right or wrong, if that makes any sense? It's a very poorly worded question, because it's saying, if you don't think that there are true rights and true wrongs, how do you know that something is truly right or truly wrong? Well, I don't believe in truly right or truly wrong, so why would this even apply? I think this is a very, very poorly worded question, and really designed to try to trick someone into a false conclusion. Very poorly worded question, and very much of a trap question. And while a lot of these questions do kind of provide a lot of thought-provoking responses, I think, and really make you sit down and think about your morals very thoroughly, This one is really... And we're going to move on to question number 10.
If you say that you do have an objective standard of morality, then where did you get this objective standard, since an objective standard is one that is not based on your opinion or your experience?
Like I said, my initial morality was an objective standard that I got from society, that then, through time, changed to a subjective standard that I've created for myself. So really, I mean, I think that answers the question. My initial objective standard came from society. Question 11.
If you say that you got your objective standard of morality from society, then what justifies the idea that society is the proper place to obtain the standard of morality?
I don't know if I would use the word proper. Certainly there are other places you can gain at least your initial foundation of an objective standard if you've since evolved away from that. And let me say, initially, when you're a child, you're almost guaranteed to start with an objective standard, even if it's just purely your parents telling you what is right and wrong. And the reason I say society, even though obviously it happens to me, is my parents really followed the societal standard, at least when I was younger. I had fairly young parents when I was growing up. They were in their early 20s, so they were still working through their morality at that time too, and very much followed the societal moral standard, which is why I say I started with the societal moral standard, even though I guess technically I got it from my parents. But certainly there are other proper places to get it. I wouldn't claim that society is the only one. But what justifies that it is a proper place is that it's the collective wisdom of basically the entire society. Now, that doesn't mean it's right in and of itself, but certainly it's a good starting place, if nothing else. Simply that you're getting an average of a large group of people. And the society has to manage all of those people. And if you're in a successful society that isn't having a lot of strife, that isn't rebelling against itself all the time, then I think that's a good point. And when I was younger, when it was, the late 80s, the early 90s, we were an extremely stable society. We still are. We have disagreements and we have moral arguments, but I still think that it's the basic baseline of society's morals, at least in the United States, is a good starting point. I do think that you do need to, at some point, sit down and think through at least individual positions as they become relevant. But like I said, I think it's a good starting point just because you're getting a good average of a large group of people. Next question.
If you say you got your objective standard of morality from society, then which society has the right moral system when they contradict each other?
Well, again, I mean, I don't subscribe to this idea of right donia and wrong donia, and it has to fit into either one. I suppose my answer to that is their right to their own societies, because they hopefully are the average of the citizenry in that society. Now, if they're not the average of the citizenry of that society, then you may have an issue. I personally believe that a society's moral standard should be reflective of that society. And if it's not, then I think that one would be in the wrong. If it is, and both of them are, then I don't view either one of them as wrong. I view them as indicative of those cultures and those societies. And they aren't necessarily wrong. Question 13.
Number 13. If you say that you got your objective standard of morality from society, then if Nazi Germany was morally wrong to put Jews to death, why was it wrong, since its morals were derived from its society?
Okay, a few things. First, I've never had a discussion with morality where the other person didn't bring up Nazis. And I hate this idea, mainly because they try to make the same point that's being made here, that Nazi Germany was a result of the German society. And it wasn't. I mean, let's be clear. Nazis did not get their morals, where Jews are concerned, from their society. And the biggest evidence of that is the vast majority of Germans did not know Jews were being put to death in concentration camps. You had towns a few miles from a concentration camp that didn't even know it existed, because the Nazis didn't want them to know it existed, because they knew that the society would be against it. And there are stories of when Americans came upon concentration camps, of them going to nearby German towns and asking them what the hell, pretty much, and the citizens didn't know anything about it. So the They marched them through the concentration camps and made them work in the concentration camps to take care of the Jews and to bury the dead bodies. And there are stories of Germans just weeping as they put body after body after body into a pit because they didn't know, because the Nazis did not tell them. The Nazis did not get their norms from their society. On top of that why is it wrong? I suppose what you're asking me here is, why is it okay for me to say that that's wrong if I have an objective moral standard from society? And of course I no longer have an objective moral standard from society, so it's not really relevant to me. Outside of that, if you believe that it's wrong to kill people based on their religion or their ethnicity, then you are justified to say that it's wrong, regardless of where you got that moral. And that's true with any moral position. Whether someone else believes that you are in the wrong on that moral position or not, you have the right to say that it's wrong. Why it is, and again, the actual question that's being asked here, this why is it wrong since its morals were derived from its society, is a false statement, because they weren't derived from the society. They were contrary to the society, and the society as a whole didn't know about it. So next question. And again, this is really another one of those trap questions that is meant to try to make you think that you're in the wrong if you don't really sit down and think about it. And yeah, I suspect as I go through this list, I'm going to run into a few more that are really disingenuous questions. And this certainly is one of them. But yes, next question, question number 14.
How is having a moral standard based on societal norms not ultimately subjective, since that society is comprised of individuals with subjective moral standards?
Well, it is ultimately subjective. I mean, that goes almost without saying. It's the average of the moral norms of the society, hopefully. So, yeah, I suppose it is ultimately subjective if you want to view it in that light. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if it is a society that's doing it in a way that it's the average morals of the society, for the most part. And, yeah, so I guess my answer is, it is ultimately subjective. Question number 15.
If you believe that society produces an objective moral standard, then how does an accumulation of individuals with subjective moral standards within that society produce an objective moral standard?
Well, I suppose that you really need to look at the objective moral standard at this point. I don't think a society's moral standard is in and of itself an objective standard. I think that it can be taken as an objective moral standard. And that's really a distinction. Like I said, when I was younger, I took the basic society morals and the standard morals of the society that I was in as an objective moral standard. It isn't really an objective moral standard, however. And that's really a distinction that I think has to be made. So my answer is that it's not producing an objective moral standard, it's producing something that can be taken as an objective moral standard. So there's a very important distinction that can be made there. As to how it gets to making that standard in the first place, I think the best example I can give is dealing with prohibition in the last century. We had alcohol prohibition, and the society decided alcohol is no longer going to be legal for the most part. You can no longer buy and sell alcohol. Well, the problem was that a very small segment of the society created that moral in the hopes to spread it to everyone. And when you get a situation where the majority of people don't agree with the moral standard being created by the society, whether it be a small group in that society, whether it being a king, you get a situation where there's going to be strife. And we had strife. We had massive crime waves, especially in Chicago, I think is the most famous, dealing with the buying and selling of alcohol illegally. And it created huge problems. It created huge problems that exist today. And it became very apparent that a huge segment of the society was not willing to follow that moral standard. And it was creating serious problems. So it was repealed. It was changed. Because it was creating too many problems. And that's how you get the moral standard of a society, is by the consent of the people in the society. And if it's differing by too large a segment of the society's morals or the society's morals will change, as they did with Prohibition. I think that's the best example that I can give of how a society gets to a certain moral position. Question 16.
If society is what determines moral truth, then how is this not committing the logical fallacy of begging the question by saying that a society determines what is right and wrong because a society determines what is right and wrong?
Well, again, we go back to this idea of right donia and wrong donia. I don't think that moral truth exists. I don't think that something is intrinsically belonging to one of these mythical countries or the other, right donia or wrong donia. So I kind of reject this question out of hand as being nonsense. I don't think there is a logical fallacy being created here. As I explained in the previous question, the society's standards are being created by its people, for the most part. They could be being created by a king or by a small group of people, but if they differ too much from the people who are being governed, you're going to see uprisings and you're going to see strife until those are changed. We saw this in a great example of this last spring, during the Arab Spring, where one Arab country after another rose up to overthrow their rulers. But this idea of moral truth, I reject out of hand. And I don't think there is a logical fallacy being created then, because I don't accept this idea of right donia and wrong donia. That moral truth kind of thought. Obviously, right donia, wrong donia are my own words. You're not saying that. But I'm using that to better explain why I don't think that they exist. So I guess that's my answer to that. I reject this question out of hand and don't accept that there is a logical fallacy because I don't accept the premise. Question number 17.
If society determines what is right and wrong, then it is deriving morals from itself. Aside from the issue of whether or not God exists, why then would you reject the rationale that God derives morals from himself and thereby declares what is right and wrong?
Wow, this is a loaded question. Okay, let's just start from the beginning. If society determines what is right and wrong, then it's deriving its morals from itself. That I don't fully agree with. Like I said, I think I've explained this quite well up to this point, that I think society derives its morals from the average morals of its people. And while its rulers can make morals that are contradictory to that, you get uprisings and strife if that occurs for a long period of time in too far of a direction. I think the best example I can point to, especially in recent times to this, is the Arab Spring, where you had just one Arab country after another in practically open revolt. Peaceful in many cases, but practically open revolt against rulers that they got fed up with for this reason. And I think just saying that the society is deriving its morals from itself is too simplistic of an explanation. And I think I think I've explained in previous questions why I think that would be simplistic. So moving on to this next sentence, the first part of this next sentence, this aside from the issue of whether or not God exists, I'm assuming that you're just asking me to say, for the sake of argument, God exists. And okay, I'll say for the rest of this sentence, let's assume for the sake of argument that God exists. You then say, why would I reject the rationale that God derives his morals from himself? And I wouldn't. Why would I? I mean, I derive my morals from my experiences, the logic, the people who have interacted with me. Why would God be any different from that? And the next part, and that God would therefore declare what is right and wrong. Well, he can declare it. He's more than welcome. You're welcome to declare what's right and wrong. I'm right to declare what's right and wrong. And that doesn't mean that you should follow what I say is right and wrong. It doesn't mean you should follow what God says is right and wrong. And it certainly doesn't mean that I should follow what God says is right and wrong. We all have brains. We all have logic. And we should, I hope, logic our own selves to what we believe is right and wrong, based on our experiences, based upon input from other people, based upon the society that we live in and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Since I do reject this idea of right donia and wrong donia and this absolute moral truth, if a being that wanted to declare itself God, or if God, as you understand him, is real, existed and tried to declare moral truths, I would reject them, whether or not he's real. I don't care. I would reject them. Even if they were the exact morals that I followed, I would reject them as moral truths, even if a God said that they were, because I don't recognize his ability to say that. Now, as far as the God of the Bible is concerned, which is who I'm assuming that you're talking about, given the nature of all these other questions and where these questions were located, the God of the Bible does many immoral things, as far as I am concerned. And that's another reason why I wouldn't just blindly accept his version of what is right and what is wrong, whether or not I agree with them or not. Yeah, so I mean I guess that answers the question. I don't reject this idea that if God is real, he would derive his own morals. Of course he would. And I don't reject the idea that he would declare what's right and wrong. What I do reject is that those things would actually be something that I would have to follow as right and wrong and moral truths. And I think I've spent enough time on this question. I think I've explained it as well as I could possibly explain it. So, moving on to question number 18.
If society determines what is right and wrong, then are the morals derived from society obligatory to all members of society?
Well, here's the thing. They're not. And again, to go back to prohibition, society decided that alcohol was immoral, and the buying and selling of alcohol was wrong, and they outlawed it. And the people pretty much said, you can go to hell. You're never obligated to follow the morals of your society. And let me be clear, that does not mean that you cannot be punished. If I were to go out and kill people under the belief that it was morally justified for me to do so, I of course could do it. I wouldn't, because I do think it's wrong. But if I was of the belief that it was okay, I would still be punished by society for doing so, because the society that I live in, the United States of America, in Virginia, has said that that is wrong and that you will be punished. So, while it's not obligatory for you to do so, you should be willing to accept the punishment for your actions from society. And if you truly believe that your society is morally bankrupt from your point of view, and that your morals are completely different from your society, you have a few options open to you. You can leave, or you can revolt, or you can get into government and try to change it. And we see this from the right-wing Christian fundamentalists, these who are actively pushing their morals in society. We have a huge debate right now where this is happening with reproductive health care for women's rights. We're seeing people who are very conservative, very Christian, who are opposing it on those grounds, who are going against the morals of society, which is currently that it's legal and they have a right to it, and they're challenging that. So you're not obligated to follow it. If you have a difference of opinion, you can try to change it. That's how you create a society. And that's a huge part of the freedom of speech and the right to challenge. So no, I wouldn't say that it's obligatory, although I do kind of put an asterisk there that if you do break the law, you need to be willing to, if you do the crime, you should be willing to pay the time. I think I've explained this one as best I can, so let's move on to question 19.
If the morals derived in society are not obligatory, then how are they proper morals that should be followed?
Well, like I think I've already made quite clear in my previous responses, I don't think that they're necessarily in and of themselves proper. If the people disagree with them, they can be changed. But if you commit a crime, you should be willing to pay the time. So, I mean, I think I've already answered this question quite thoroughly in previous questions. To put it quite simply, well, I don't think they're obligatory. I don't think they necessarily are proper. So this is another one where I kind of reject the premise. I don't think that just because a society has reached a moral position, that it therefore is a proper moral on any given issue. And yeah, so we'll just move on to the next question. Question number 20.
If the morals derived in society are obligatory, then from where do you derive the right to impose them on people?
Well, I think I've already said quite a few times, this is another one where I kind of reject the premise that I don't think they are obligatory. If they were, well, I mean, I'm not even going to get into that because I don't think that they are. As far as laws go, if which is where I think they're kind of getting into this, why maybe this question is trying to ask why societies are able to create laws if their morals aren't obligatory. Because you have to. I mean, a society has to have rules. Those rules can be changed, however, and that's why there's a right to impose them on people, I guess, if you want to get right down to the nitty-gritty. Because if the people don't agree with them and are strongly against them, they can be changed. If it's a society where there's a king, there can be a revolt if the people really disagree with it that much. If it's a situation that we have here in the United States, we can elect new representatives. We can get rid of the people who created those laws and put in new people to overrule those laws or create laws better in keeping with the morals in society. So I would say that's where the justification comes from to enforce them, because they are essentially coming, whether it's in a roundabout way or whether or not it's from consent. This I don't know how many people heard of rulers rule by consent of the governed, but it's very much true. Even in a situation with kings, they have only the power that the people allow them to have. So if the people disagree too much with something coming from down on high from their rulers, they will get changed eventually, whether it's through elections, whether it's through revolt or demonstrations. And from that point of view, that's where society gets its justification to enforce its laws. And if you want to get more deeper into that, we pretty much just have to turn this into a civics course, and I don't think that's where you want to go. Let's just keep it to morals, and if you want a more explained detail of my logic for all of that, you can ask a whole different bunch of questions on civics. But we'll move on to the next question.
If you say that society has the right to impose its morals on people, then how can you legitimately complain against Nazi Germany or the Jews of the Old Testament, since both societies impose their morals on people?
Oh, God, the Nazi Germany thing again. Like I said, I hate people who bring up Nazis, because really there's this attempt to just cloud the issue with emotion. But that being said, you asked the questions. Let's work through it. I have pretty much said that society has the right to impose its morals through laws on its people. As I said, because the people can overthrow those laws through whatever means they have available to them if they disagree with them strongly enough. And then it asks how I can legitimately claim. Well, let's start with the Nazi Germany thing. Like I already explained, they hid it from its people. So that's one way I can say I can legitimately complain. But even if they didn't, I can legitimately complain because I can explain why I think it's wrong. As long as you can create an argument that makes sense for why you oppose a certain thing that's either happened or a moral position that someone else has, whether it be the Nazis or whether it be your next door neighbor, you have a legitimate complaint. So it doesn't matter if they were, in the logic that I put out, right to enforce these laws from a certain point of view. And again, this is why I hate the Nazi thing, because the Nazis did not have the consent of the people to wipe out the Jews. They did create a situation where the Jews were hated, but then they weren't telling people, they were killing them in job lots. The German people didn't know about that. So you bringing it up, really, you can't even talk about it in this sense, because it's really a straw man in a certain way. So I mean, if I were to say that, yes, okay, a society can make its laws and it's able to enforce it, and then you bring up Nazi Germany and say, well, were they right to do that? Well, no, they weren't. And I'm not even going to get into, well, if they did, because they didn't. And it's not something that really should even be brought up. They did not have the consent of the German people to create the concentration camps. They did not have the consent of the people to wipe out Jews in job lots and perform experiments on them and create biological weapons by infecting them. They didn't have that. And constantly bringing up the Nazis really is just an attempt to confuse the issue. And if you don't see why, I mean, I don't know how to help you with this. Because, I mean, this is how this normally goes. Is I say that, yes, society has the right to impose its morals, because the people can object and revolt to it. And then the other person says, well, then you have to think that Nazis were okay to wipe out the Jews. And if you don't stop and think about it for a second, and you just say no, the other person goes, well, then you're contradicting yourself. But you're not. Because, like I said, the Nazis didn't have the consent of the governed. And even if they did, I still have a legitimate complaint that they were wrong to do so. As far as the Jews of the Old Testament goes, this is where it's their society maybe to burn down a village, kill everyone in it, grab the virgin children for the purposes of raping them. I think that is wrong. And I can create legitimate complaints for why that is wrong. Even though that was the morals of those people that it was okay to do so. And they had the right to impose those morals on themselves. Here's the problem. They're not imposing those morals upon themselves. They're going out and imposing them on other people. That's my complaint against the Jews of the Old Testament. In a nutshell. My biggest complaint against the Jews of the Old Testament. So again, you're creating almost a straw man here, where your argument really doesn't apply to Jews of the Old Testament, and it certainly does not apply to the Nazis. I cannot express how much I hate it when people bring that up. It shuts down the conversation the second you mention the word Nazis. It shuts it down. There's too much emotion involved with that, and there's too little understanding of really how the Nazis got done what they got done to really have a constructive dialogue. So I've spent more than enough time on this question. We're going to move on to the next one, question number 22.
If you say your moral standard is based on common sense, then what do you do when what is common sense for one person contradicts what is common sense for someone else?
I mean, I don't think morals should be based upon common sense. I mean, common sense, when you get right down to it, is a position you take on something without really thinking through why you took that position. Like, someone should tie their shoes. It seems like common sense. And most people will agree. But few people... and everyone knows why you should tie your shoes, so you don't trip. But on a certain level, most things that are declared common sense are declared that because the person hasn't really thought why that position should be taken. They've just declared that it's common sense, which I hate. If you have a position, explain how you got to that position. Don't just try to say, oh, it's sense. So this question really doesn't apply to me because I don't think moral standards should be based on common sense. And if you claim to be basing your morals on common sense, I think you really need to take a step back and decide why you got to that position more thoroughly than just saying, oh, it's common sense. Because you're really not thinking at that point. You're just usually blindly accepting what someone else has told you. And as I've said in previous questions, I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. Now, as far as the second part of this question, if someone, like I said, if someone contradicts with me, what do I do? Well, I want to talk to them. I want to find out how we got to different points of view. And then, if I still think at that point that the other person has committed a logical fallacy or has made a mistake in his reasoning, I try to point that out. And if that person believes that I have, I want him to point that out to me. And I'm not saying that, to try to take a moral high ground. I really want them to contradict me if they truly think that I am wrong. Because maybe I have committed an error in my logic. And if I have, I want to know. So I guess my answer to the second part is debate. Debate, 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 debate. Like what's going on right here. Debate. Talk about it. Show how you got to your positions. And work it out from there. Question number 23.
If what you believe is common sense contradicts what someone else considers to be common sense, then are your judgments really common sense?
Well, somebody's isn't. I mean, this isn't even a question on morals. It's just a question on common sense. If, like I said, the whole idea with common sense is you don't really think about it. So if you both haven't really thought about it, and you both have different opinions, and you're both claiming it's common sense, then at least one of you is wrong, and possibly both of you is wrong. So you need to sit down at that point and really examine it, and then you both need to point out what, the positions that you've come to. But obviously, at least one person's wrong, and possibly both of you are wrong. I suppose when it comes to moral issues, if it's... Now, this only applies to people in the same situation. If it's people in two different types of cultures and two completely different types of situations, then I suppose you could both be right. But if it's similar people, similar situations, similar circumstances, similar societies, somebody's wrong. Possibly both of you are wrong. And like I said, I reject the notion of common sense as being a stupid idea in and of itself. You should always take the 2 seconds to think through something and decide for yourself, logically, what your position on a subject is. Don't just fall back on, oh, well, it's common sense, isn't it? Because that's really a cheat. So, moving on to question number 24.
If, however, you say that your common sense morals should be followed by others because they're right, then how is that not being arrogant, since you are elevating your personal, subjective moral opinions above those of others and saying they should follow what you believe?
Well, I'm of course not, because I don't have common sense morals, and if I find out that I do, I instantly need to examine them and come to a proper conclusion. And if I did, yeah, that would be insanely arrogant. Which is why I don't do it. So I guess on this, I'm kind of agreeing with the point that you're making, that if somebody does have a common sense moral, and declares that other people should follow it, which I never say that other people should follow my morals just because they're my morals. I explained that in a previous question. Yes, that would be insanely arrogant. So, next question.
If you say that your moral standard, whether social or personal, is evolving and getting better, then by what non-subjective standard do you judge that it is getting better?
Well, now this question is pretty much the same as the next one that he's about to ask. It's just worded differently, so let's just go ahead, get to the next question. I'll answer pretty much both of them at the same time.
If you say that your moral standard, whether social or personal, is evolving and getting better, then how do you know it is getting better without committing the logical fallacy of begging the question by saying things are getting better because they're evolving?
Well, this is an interesting question. Because I guess from a certain point of view, you could say that my moral standard has evolved over time. I started with just a objective standard that I derived from society. And as I said, I over time, I edited that and changed my positions and got to the moral standard I'm at today. But I wouldn't necessarily say, on some positions I would say that I think I've got a better moral standard, because I've learned more about certain situations, or I've had them pointed out to me, and I've been shown to think about them. Like, let's go back to that situation with the birth control to teenagers. My initial position was very knee-jerk reaction, and it didn't require a lot of thought from me. I just accepted that people should not have access to birth control if they're not married, and certainly not if they're teenagers. And I had it pointed out to me very clearly that that was a very illogical position to take, because it could be harmful to society, that it would create a situation where you have teen pregnancy rampant. So I changed my position for what I believe is the better, because I had to sit down and really think about it, which I had never really done before. So from that point of view, I would say it got better. I wouldn't say that it's in and of itself getting better because it's evolving, and I wouldn't necessarily say that just because I changed my position on something, that my old position wasn't correct. Let's say if somehow I was 100 years old. Obviously I'm not, I'm actually in my 20s, but let's say I was 100 years old, and when I was younger, I believed that, not the birth control issue, but let's just say sex in general, that you shouldn't have sex before marriage. There were very good reasons 100 years ago why society had this kind of moral standard that you shouldn't have sex before marriage. And it was that birth control wasn't readily available. And you had a risk of STDs, you had a risk of pregnancy. Pregnancy was much more dangerous 60 or 70 years ago than it is right now. There was a certain element of danger to it. If you were very young and you got pregnant, there was even more of a sense of danger to it, and you could die very easily. If you were by yourself, you lacked a support structure often to help take care of the child after they were born, which created societal problems. There was a risk of STDs, which obviously there's still a risk of STDs now, but their health care was not as readily available back then. Syphilis, could make you go crazy and kill you. Now, you can cure syphilis if you catch it early enough with a simple shot. It's very easy to test for it. Back then, that wasn't the case. So there were a plethora of very serious reasons why sex before marriage wasn't necessarily the smartest idea in the world. The world has changed since then. So if I had that moral standard then, I could have very good reasons for why I got to that moral standard. Those reasons, however, don't really apply to the world as it is today. So if I then change my opinion at some point between then and now, assuming I was 100 years old. Yes, my position has evolved, but it's evolved to changing circumstances. I wouldn't necessarily that it's any better than my position was back then, but it's just the reality of the situation has changed, and my moral would have changed along with it. So, I guess what I'm saying is, just because your morals are evolving doesn't mean that it's getting better. It just means that it's changing to current situations. It can get better, and it can get better, I believe, if your previous position wasn't one that you really ever gave any serious thought to. And that can apply even if you take, like, say if you took a position that, if my initial position was that they should have access to health care, or not health care, birth control, the teenagers. But if I had never truly thought about why I had that position, if I had just accepted it from my friends, and then one day I had to sit down and really think about why I took that position, even if my position did not change and I still held the same one, because I had given it more thought, because I had sat down and really logically out why I should take this position and why I believe it is correct, and now I can actually defend it, I would consider that to be better, even if my position didn't change. And I don't think you're begging the question in those cases. So, next question. Question number 27.
If you say your standard is evolving and getting better, then can you assert that it won't evolve into something that contradicts what you believe now, thereby demonstrating that your moral beliefs now were really wrong?
Well, in a way, I think I answered this question in the previous one. Just because it's evolving doesn't mean it's better. And certainly, in the example I gave, if I was 100 years old, for the sake of argument, and my position on sex before marriage had changed, obviously those two contradict each other. But that doesn't mean that the old one was wrong, because the situation that informed the old position has changed. It may have been right at that time, and the one I have now might be right at this time, even though they contradict each other. But in the situation that I gave with the teenagers having access to birth control, obviously my two positions do contradict each other, and so therefore, obviously, I cannot assert that the positions that I have will never evolve into something that contradicts what I believe now in a very real way. And those two do. I think that anyone should have access to birth control. And I did not always feel that way. And the situation has not changed. It's just that I had never logicked my way through it. So obviously, I cannot say that I can assert that it won't evolve into something that truly does contradict me. And that's really all I have to say with that question. And aside from, it contradicted my old one, and I do believe my old position was wrong. So, moving on. Question number 28.
If your moral standard is evolving and can contradict itself, can that system of moral determination be true, since it can produce self-contradiction?
Wow, see, this is a very poorly worded question, and I think whoever put this question really didn't give it much thought. This is another one we kind of have to take step by step. So, if your moral standard is evolving and can contradict itself, which I've just admitted it can, in a very real way. You know, there are the two different types of contradictions. There's the contradiction where you're contradicting yourself, but only because the situation has changed, and neither of your position was really wrong at the time. Or I guess I should say you believe that your positions were right at the time, would be a better way of putting it. And there's the contradiction where you realize that you were wrong, and you admit to yourself that you were wrong before. And that's the contradiction I think that this question really is trying to get to. But then it goes to, can the system of moral determination be true since it can produce self-contradiction? And I think I get the general direction you're going to, but you've worded this very poorly. I mean, can the system of moral determination be true? Well, no. Because how could it be true? I mean, this is like asking if the system of gassing up your car can be true. How can it can't be true or false. It's just a system of doing something. it can. What I think you're trying to get to, and I'm going to assume that this is what this question's trying to ask, and it was just very poorly written, is can it be a good system? So I'm just going to scratch out true and put good, and I truly hope that's what you're trying to ask here, and it was just poorly written. And if not, you can, send me a message to my YouTube account, and I'll try to pound out what this question's asking. But I'm assuming that you're asking if it can be a good system. And when it comes to my system, since I'm assuming you're asking again, that this is again one of these why it's poorly written. I'm assuming you're asking if my system of moral determination can be good, if it can produce a self-contradiction. I'm assuming that that's what you're asking with this question, and if that is, then yes, I believe it is a good system. Because the system I have now is one where I sit down and think about it, and the ones where I really have a true contradiction are ones where I either never thought about it, such as in the situation with the teenage birth control, or I didn't have access to all of the facts, or I made a logical mistake. And if I made a logical mistake, eventually with the system I created, I truly hope I would realize that I had, and I can fix it. And I think if you have a moral system of determining what is right and wrong, that allows for you to admit that you were wrong, then you have a good system. And that's really the system that I think I have, where I'm willing to question my beliefs. I'm willing to have other people question my beliefs. And as I said before, if you think I have a bad belief, and if you think I got to that belief through a fallacy or a straw man argument, or whether or whether I don't have access to all the facts, or for whatever the reason is, I want you to challenge me. And if I realize that you're right, I'll change my position. And as long as you have a moral system where you're willing to do that, where you're willing to admit that, oh my goodness, I was wrong, yes, that can produce self-contradiction, but that's why it's a good system. Because you can realize that you were wrong, and you can change, for hopefully the better. So in a way, I guess, like I said, this question's very poorly written, but I would say that because it can produce self-contradiction, it is a good system. Because you're willing to say, I was wrong. So next question.
If you say your morals are self-determined, then are they true for everyone or just for you?
Well, again, we get to this idea of absolute truth and absolute false with this question, the rightism and the wrongism countries. And in a way, I think I've already answered this question. I would never say that someone else should follow my morals just because they're my morals. I mean, they're self-determined, but they're self-determined by me. Why would they be good for someone else? You should never just accept someone else's morals because you think that they're good morals. You should logic your way through them, and if you arrive at the same point, all the better. If you arrive at different points, then you need to challenge each other. And you should never just accept someone else's morals on faith and assume that they're good morals. That's foolish. Think for yourself. So, I suppose I would say that they're... Again, I'm going to swap out true and put good, because I'm assuming that's what you're asking. Are they good for everyone or just for you? Because, like I said, I reject this idea that they're true or they're false. No. They're good for me. They may be good for you. And the way that you should figure that out is to examine them for yourself and logic your way to them through your own experiences, through your own influence, through your own circumstances. And if you arrive at a different point, challenge the other person. Challenge me. And I think that's the best answer I can give for this question. So we'll move on. Question number 30.
If your self-determined morals are true only for you, then do you have the right to judge the morals of anyone else, such as the God of the Bible, by saying they are wrong?
This is another one where I'm just going to mentally insert good, because, again, I reject this idea of true and false. And the reason is you keep throwing out these, the true, implying that there's a false, when I don't agree, because I have self-determined morals, that there is a true objective standard, that something is either true or it is false from a moral perspective, period. And you just have to kind of figure out which one is which, or accept some commandment from on high that it's true or false. So I reject that. So every time I see true in any of these questions, I'm just going to keep mentally inserting good. So if your self-determined morals are good only for you, which, again, they are good for me, and they may be good for you, but let's say that they're good only for me, then do I have the right to judge the morals of anyone else, such as God or the Bible, by saying they are wrong? Yes! I absolutely do. I cannot say that any more emphatically. Yes. This is why. In the same way that someone else should challenge me if they believe my morals are wrong, and I should challenge them if they believe their morals are wrong, why wouldn't I be able to do the same thing to the God of the Bible if he was real? It would be foolish of me not to, and not to point out the things that I think are wrong, and to explain why I think they're wrong. And as far as whether or not I have the right to, of course I have the right to. Our entire modern culture is based upon the freedom of speech, is based upon pointing out where we think we differ on our morals. It's the foundation of at least my country and many other Western countries, and even in countries where it's not necessarily the foundation. Of course they have the right to do that. That's how you get the Arab Spring, where all of these different Arab countries are revolting. You have the intrinsic right to challenge someone else's morals. I don't care if it's the guy next street, or next door on the street, sorry. I don't care if it's Buddha, God, Jehovah, Thor, the flying spaghetti monster, the great Juju of the mountain. You have the right to challenge someone else's morals if you think they're wrong, and if you think that you can create a valid argument against them. Absolutely. I cannot say it more emphatically than that. I would go so far as to say that's one of my core morals. The ability to challenge what someone else thinks. And if I was a Christian and I truly believed that the God of the Bible had the right morals, I would encourage people to challenge them. And I would encourage you to defend them. Because hopefully, either your morals, you'll realize that the God of the sorry, I'm tripping over my own tongue here. Either you would realize that the God of the Bible does not have good morals, or hopefully the other person would realize that the God of the Bible does have good morals. And you'll come to some consensus. One of the two. Now, it's more likely that you'll both just get frustrated and walk away. That happens all the time. But if the God of the Bible really does have great morals, and I disagree, how else are you going to get me to agree with your point of view if I don't say that they're wrong, and if I don't challenge them, therefore giving you the chance to challenge me? So not only do I have the right to, I would imagine that you would just want to encourage me to, because it gives you the opening to have this conversation. And it's one of the great things about freedom of speech. And it's something that's often lost upon people who try to say, well, you don't have the right to challenge something. Because you're trying to shut down the argument and just arm twist somebody into accepting your point of view. And as I've said again and again, forcing someone to take any point of a moral just because you believe it and just because you want to enforce it is extremely dangerous. It's how you get a situation like we have in North Korea. It's how you get the Dark Ages. No matter how great your intentions may be and how noble your intentions may be, the only way that you're going to create a stable society in the long term is to talk out these problems. And you're never going to get it if you don't think someone has the right to challenge them. Whether you get your morals from God on high, or whether you get your morals from self-determination. And it's another question I think I've spent enough time on and fully explained myself on, but it is easily, I think, the most important question on this list. And I really wanted to make my position on it crystal clear. So we'll move on to the next one. Question number 31, getting into instinct, which, well, we'll listen to the question and then we'll talk about it.
If you say that your morals are derived from instinct, which is brain-programmed behavior, then how are they morals and not simply brain patterns to which you arbitrarily attach moral values? If you say that your morals are derived from instinct, which is brain-programmed behavior, then wouldn't that mean that different people's brains would produce different moral values? If you say that your morals are derived from instinct, which is brain-programmed behavior, then how would you really know if anything is right or wrong?
Well, I don't think that morals... Well, see, this is an interesting question. Can you derive your morals from instinct? And now that I've actually given it some thought, I suppose you can. And an example that I would give is a mother being willing to do something to protect her child. And the whole unconditional motherly love that is really instinctual. And the society instinct to protect young children as a whole, outside of even the motherly love thing. I think that you can derive a moral from that. But then saying, well, how would you really know if anything's right or wrong? By logicking it out. Why would we want, as human beings, to follow this instinct to protect young children? Because if we didn't, and we just let them fend for themselves, they would die. And if they died, if all the children died, our society would end at the current generation. And when we got older, there'd be no one to care for us. When we became infirm, older adults, all of society would break down if there were no more children, because we just let them languish on the birthing table and the mom just got up and walked away. So, yes, I think you can derive morals from instinct. And the way how you know if they're right or wrong is to give it 2 seconds of thought. That does not mean that an instinct necessarily is morally right. Fight or flight, I think, might be a good example of that. It's going to depend on the situation, whether or not you just turning around and running because you don't have to fight is the morally correct thing to do. But that doesn't mean that an instinct is always wrong or always right. It's going to depend on the situation in some cases. And in some cases, like protecting small children, you can very easily understand why it's the right thing to do, even though it is an instinct. So, thinking about it, I guess, is my final answer to this question. Just thinking about it and coming to a conclusion is how you're going to know if it's right or wrong. So, next question. Question number 34.
If you say that your morals are derived from instinct, which is brain-programmed behavior, then how does one neurochemical state of the brain that leads to another neurochemical state produce proper moral truths?
Wow, I am not a brain surgeon. I'm not even entirely sure what this question's trying to ask. If you say your morals are derived from instinct, which is brain-programmed behavior, okay, I've said that they can be derived from instinct, so this does somewhat relate to me. And I'll admit that a decent explanation for instinct or definition for instinct is brain-programmed behavior, so I'm with you so far. Then how does one neurochemical state of the brain that leads to another neurochemical state produce proper moral truths? Like I said, I reject this idea of moral truths. So, like I've been doing all the whole time, I'm just going to mentally insert good instead of truth and read this as produce proper good morals, or just good morals instead of proper morals. God, I don't know. I'm, I mean, I'm not a brain surgeon, and I don't think anybody truly knows how the brain works. And I don't know if this is the proper place to ask this kind of question. I have no idea, and I have no problem with saying that. And this sort of question gets brought up sometime in moral arguments where it's, well, if you're just determining what is true and you're not listening to some higher authority, then you're just basing it off of, what's happening in your brain, and can't something happen in your brain that creates a problem? And yeah, but I mean, we as human beings do not have a full enough understanding of how the brain operates to answer these type of questions at this time. I certainly don't. And, yeah, I don't even know where to begin. I'm not a brain surgeon. I mean, I don't know how else to say it other than that. I get a vague idea of where you're trying to take this question, but just on its own merits, man, I can't answer it. And it's really the only question in this entire list that really has me scratching my head, but not because I can't logic my way to it, but because I don't have the proper scientific understanding of how the brain works to answer it. And I suppose I could sit down for the next 3 months and do my own study on the brain and read papers and try to get to that, but I don't think it's worth it to answer this question in this context. As far as how we can get to moral or good morals, I'm substituting good for truth again because I don't accept the idea of a moral truth. How we can get to good morals from an instinct, well, like I said, you logic your way through it. And if that involves neurochemical states influencing another neurochemical state, then okay. I don't claim to know precisely how the brain works and how that occurs at the cellular level. I don't think I need to. I can logic my way through it, regardless of the actual scientific process that allows me to logic my way through it, which I think is really the crux of what we're talking about here. So as far as precisely how the brain works, I really don't think it's relevant, and I'm just going to move on at this point. Question number 35.
If you really don't know what is right or wrong, but just go with whatever works, then what gives you the right to complain about anyone's moral actions, anytime, anywhere, since different behaviors work for different people in different situations?
Well, this is another one that I'll take in pairs. If you really don't know what is right or wrong, well, again, I reject this idea of absolute right and absolute wrong. And I suppose I do go with whatever works. Whatever I think logically works for society is what I go with. But, then what gives you the right to complain? Again, I have the right to complain. I don't know how else I can put... We as human beings complain all the time. We have the right to. The best civilizations in the world, the most modern, the most well-educated, the most industrialized, the most productive, the happiest civilizations... Well, let me not say happiest, because we're getting into really sketchy territory, though. But the civilizations that have proven very, very, very successful have the right to complain. Because how else are you going to get to an understanding? Societies as a whole have to work together on some level. And you're not going to be able to properly work together if you don't have an understanding. And how are you going to get to an understanding if you don't complain and if you don't have debates and you don't challenge other people's belief systems to get to a better understanding between the two of you, at the very least, of where you're coming from? You have the right to complain. Even if what works for me is different than what works for you in your situation, I want to understand where your situation comes from. And I want you to understand how your situation and how your morals would affect me if you tried to push your morals on me. And how else am I going to do that if I don't complain? And if I don't point them out? And if we don't have debates like this? For the love of God, you have the right to complain! Moving on. Question number 36.
If you really don't know what is right or wrong, but just go with whatever works, then how is moral stability obtained when whatever works can change depending on circumstances and goals?
I think I've made it quite clear in my other questions that I don't believe in moral stability. My own morals have changed, and they, in all likelihood, will change a few more times throughout my life, either as situations change or I realize that I was misinformed on something or logically wrong. You know, I've explained this several times. My morals have changed, and I've seen other people's morals change, and certainly society's morals change. The prohibition example I gave is a great example of that. Sex before marriage is a great example of that. It's accepted in modern culture. It wasn't 100 years ago, and because really the situations have changed. And you have the whole situation with the Arab Spring. I mean, moral stability. What moral stability? There is no moral stability. And that's a good thing. Being able to admit that you're wrong is a good thing. Changing situations, causing change in your morality is a good thing because the situations have changed. There's never been a moral system that's been a catch-all, one-size-fits-all moral system for every society in the world at every point in time. Does not exist, never will exist, cannot exist. So why would you want moral stability? That it would be scary as hell. And if you believe in moral stability and you want moral stability, man, really sit down and think about why you would want that. If the situation changes and the reason you had a moral position changes, why would you want to just doggedly stick to that moral position if it's no longer valid? If the reasons why you took that moral position are no longer valid, I guess I should say. So yeah, moral stability seems to me like a really bad idea. Why would you want that? But that's the last question. Hopefully I've answered most of them. There were a few questions that I flat out, said were traps, because I believe they were traps and I didn't really answer. But hopefully I at least, with those questions, explained why I believe they were traps, and in so doing, somewhat answered the question, to the best of my ability. And, if you have any other questions that you want to pose, I'll be more than happy to answer them. And I'll wrap this up by saying that, I do have self-determined morals, and I do believe that challenging morals is one of the most important things you can do for society and for humanity at large. And challenging your own morals, I think, is very important. And above all, you should have the ability to admit that you were wrong. And I'll end it on that note. Thank you.